Alright, so for this video, we'll be talking about the eugenics movement that led up to and influenced not only what happened in Germany, but also um, the eugenics movement behind um, the creation uh, and distribution of the bioweapon that we call AIDS. Now, eugenics was created in the United States and cultivated in California decades before Hitler came to power. California eugenicists played an important, although little known, role in the American eugenics movement and the American eugenics movement's campaign for ethnic cleansing. In its extreme racist form, this meant wiping away all human beings deemed unfit, preserving only those who conformed to a Nordic stereotype. Elements of the philosophy were enshrined as national policy by forced sterilization and segregation laws, as well as marriage restrictions enacted in 27 states. In 1909, California became the third state to adopt such laws. Ultimately, eugenics practitioners coercively sterilized some 60,000 Americans, barred the marriage of thousands, forcibly segregated thousands in colonies, and persecuted untold numbers in ways we are just learning. Before World War II, nearly half of coercive sterilizations were done in California, and even after the war, the state accounted for a third of all such surgeries. California was considered an epicenter of the American eugenics movement. During the 20th century's first decades, California's eugenicists included potent but little-known race scientists, such as Army venereal disease specialist Dr. Paul Popenoe, citrus magnate Paul Gosney, Sacramento banker Charles Goth, as well as members of the California State Board of Charities and Corrections and the University of California Board of Regents. Eugenics would have been so much bizarre parlor talk had it not been for extensive financing by corporate philanthropies, specifically the Carnegie, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad Fortune. They were all in league with some of America's most respected scientists from such prestigious universities as Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. These academicians espoused race theory and race science, and then faked and twisted data to serve eugenics' racist aims. In 1904, the Carnegie Institution established a laboratory complex at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island that stockpiled millions of index cards on ordinary Americans, as researchers carefully plotted the removal of families, bloodlines, and whole peoples. From Cold Spring Harbor, eugenics advocates agitated in the legislature of America, as well as the nation's social service agencies and associations. The Harriman Railroad Fortune paid local charities, such as the New York Bureau of Industries and Immigration, to seek out Jewish, Italian, and other immigrants in New York and other crowded cities and subject them to deportation, confinement, or forced sterilization. The Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program and even funded the program that Josef Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. Much of the spiritual guidance and political agitation for the American eugenics movement came from California's quasi-autonomous eugenics societies, such as Pasadena's Human Betterment Foundation and the California branch of the American Eugenics Society, which coordinated much of their activity with the Eugenics Research Society in Long Island. These organizations, which functioned as part of a closely knit network, published racist eugenic newsletters and pseudo-scientific journals, such as Eugenical News and Eugenics, and propagandized for the Nazis. Eugenics was born as a scientific curiosity in the Victorian Age. In 1863, Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, theorized that if talented people married only other talented people, the result would be measurably better offspring. At the turn of the last century, Galton's ideas were imported to the United States just as Gregor Mendel's principles of heredity were rediscovered. In the United States, demographically reeling from immigration, upheaval, and torn by post-Reconstruction chaos, race conflict was everywhere in the early 20th century. Elitists, utopians, and so-called progressives fused their smoldering race fears and class bias with their desire to make a better world. They reinvented Galton's eugenics into a repressive and racist ideology. The intent: populate the earth with vastly more of their own socio-economic and biological kind, and less or none of everyone else. The superior species the eugenics movement sought was populated not merely by tall, strong, talented people. Eugenicists craved blond, blue-eyed Nordic types. This group alone, they believed, was fit to inherit the earth. In the process, the movement intended to subtract emancipated Negroes, immigrant Asian laborers, Indians, Hispanics, East Europeans, Jews, dark-haired hill folk, poor people, the infirm, and anyone classified outside the gentrified genetic lines drawn up by American raceologists. How? By identifying the so-called defective family trees and subjecting them to lifelong segregation and sterilization programs to kill their bloodlines. The grand plan was to literally wipe out the reproductive capability of those deemed weak and inferior, the so-called unfit. The eugenicists hoped to neutralize the viability of 10% of the population at a sweep until none were left except themselves. 18 solutions were explored in Carnegie-supported 1911 preliminary report of the Committee of the Eugenics Society of the American Breeders Association to study and to report on the best practical means for cutting off the defective germplasm in the human population. Point number 8 was euthanasia. The most commonly suggested method of eugenicide in the United States was a lethal chamber or public locally operated gas chambers in 1918. Popenoe, the Army venereal disease specialist during World War I, co-wrote the widely used textbook Applied Eugenics, which argued from an historical point of view the first method which presents itself is execution. Its value in keeping up the standard of the race should not be underestimated. Applied Eugenics also devoted a chapter to lethal selection, which operated through the destruction of the individual by some adverse feature of the environment, such as excessive cold or bacteria, or by bodily deficiency. Eugenic breeders believed American society was not ready to implement an organized lethal solution, but many mental institutions and doctors practiced improvised medical lethality and passive euthanasia on their own. One institution in Lincoln, Illinois, fed its incoming patients milk from tubercular cows, believing a eugenically strong individual would be immune. 30 to 40% annual death rates resulted in Lincoln. Some doctors practiced passive eugenicide, one newborn infant at a time. Other doctors at mental institutions engaged in lethal neglect. None of the less, with eugenicide marginalized, the main solution for eugenicists was the rapid expansion of forced segregation and sterilization, as well as more marriage restrictions. California led the nation, performing nearly all sterilization procedures with little or no due process. In its first 25 years of eugenics legislation, California sterilized 9,782 individuals, mostly women. Many were classified as bad girls, diagnosed as passionate, oversexed, or sexually wayward. At the Sonoma State Home, some women were sterilized because of what was deemed an abnormally large clitoris or labia. In 1933 alone, at least 1,278 coercive sterilizations were performed, 700 on women. The state's two leading sterilization mills in 1933 were Sonoma State Home, with 388 operations, and a Patton State Hospital, with 363 operations. Other sterilization centers included Agnews, Mendocino, Napa, Norwalk, Stockton, and Pacific Colony State Hospitals. Even the U.S. Supreme Court endorsed aspects of eugenics. In its famous 1927 decision, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This decision opened the floodgates for thousands to be coercively sterilized or otherwise persecuted as subhuman. Years later, the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials quoted Holmes' words in their own defense. Only after eugenics became entrenched in the United States was the campaign transplanted into Germany, in no small measure through the efforts of California eugenicists who published booklets idealizing sterilization and circulated them to German officials and scientists. Hitler studied American eugenics laws. He tried to legitimize his anti-Semitism by medicalizing it and wrapping it in the more palatable pseudoscientific facade by eugenics. Hitler was able to recruit more followers among reasonable Germans by claiming that science was on his side. Hitler's race hatred sprung from his own mind, but the intellectual outlines of the eugenics Hitler opted in 1924 were made in America. During the 20s, Carnegie Institution eugenic scientists cultivated deep personal and professional relationships with Germany's fascist eugenicists. In Mein Kampf, published in 1924, Hitler quoted American eugenic ideology and openly displayed a thorough knowledge of American eugenics. There is today one state, wrote Hitler, in which at least weak beginnings toward a better conception of immigration are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the United States. Hitler proudly told his comrades just how closely he followed the progress of the American eugenics movement. I have studied with great interest, he told a fellow Nazi, the laws of several American states concerning prevention of reproduction by people whose progeny would, in all probability, be of no value or be injurious to the racial stock. Hitler even wrote a fan letter to American eugenics leader Madison Grant, calling his race-based eugenics book The Passing of the Great Race, his Bible. Now, the American term Nordic was freely exchanged with Germanic or Aryan. Race science, racial purity, and racial dominance became the driving force behind Hitler's Nazism. Nazi eugenics would ultimately dictate who would be persecuted in a Reich-dominated Europe, how people would live, and how they would die. Nazi doctors would become the unseen generals in Hitler's war against the Jews and other Europeans deemed inferior. Doctors would create the science, devise the eugenic formulas, and hand-select the victims for sterilization, euthanasia, and mass extermination. During the Reich's early years, eugenicists across America welcomed Hitler's plans as the logical fulfillment of their own decades of research and effort. California eugenicists republished Nazi propaganda for American consumption. They also arranged for Nazi scientific exhibits, such as an August 1934 display at the LA County Museum for the annual meeting of the American Public Health Association. By 1926, Rockefeller had donated some $410,000, almost $4 million in today's money, to hundreds of German researchers. In May 1926, Rockefeller awarded $250,000 toward creation of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry. Among the leading psychiatrists at the German Psychiatric Institute was Ernst Rudin, who became director and eventually an architect of Hitler's systematic medical repression. Another in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute complex of eugenics institutions was the Institute for Brain Research. Since 1915, it had operated out of a single room. Everything changed when Rockefeller money arrived in 1929. A grant of $317,000 allowed the Institute to construct a major building and take center stage in German race biology. The Institute received additional grants from the Rockefeller Foundation during the next several years. Leading the Institute once again was Hitler's medical henchman Ernst Rudin. Rudin's organization became a prime director and recipient of the murderous experimentation and research conducted on Jews, Gypsies, and others. Beginning in 1940, thousands of Germans taken from old-age homes, mental institutions, and other custodial facilities were systematically gassed. Between 50,000 and 100,000 were eventually killed. Leon Whitney, Executive Secretary of the American Eugenics Society, declared of Nazism, "While we were pussyfooting around, the Germans were calling a spade a spade. A special recipient of Rockefeller funding was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics in Berlin. For decades, American eugenicists had craved twins to advance their research into heredity. The Institute was now prepared to undertake such research on an unprecedented level. On May 13, 1932, the Rockefeller Foundation in New York dispatched a radiogram to its Paris office. June meeting executive committee, $9,000 over a 3-year period to Kaiser Wilhelm German Psychiatric Institute. Anthropology for research on twins and effects on later generations of substance toxic for germplasm. At the time of Rockefeller's endowment, Ottmar Freer von Virchow, a hero in American eugenic circles, functioned as a head of the Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity and Eugenics. Rockefeller funding of that institute continued both directly and through other research conduits during Virchow's early tenure. In 1935, Virchow left the institute to form a rival eugenics facility in Frankfurt that was much heralded in the American eugenics press. Research on twins in the Third Reich exploded, backed by government decrees. Virchow wrote in Der Urbarst, a eugenics doctor's journal he edited, that Germany's war would yield a total solution to the Jewish problem. Virchow had a longtime assistant. His name was Josef Mengele. On May 30th, 1943, Mengele arrived at Auschwitz. Virchow notified the German Research Society, "My assistant, Dr. Josef Mengele, joined me in this branch of research. He is presently employed as captain and camp physician in the Auschwitz concentration camp. Anthropological testing of the most diverse racial groups in this concentration camp is being carried out with permission of SS Himmler." Mengele began searching the boxcar arrivals for twins. When he found them, he performed beastly experiments, scrupulously wrote up the reports, and sent the paperwork back to Virchow's institute for evaluation. Often cadavers, eyes, and other body parts were also dispatched to Berlin's eugenic institutes. After the war, eugenics was declared a crime against humanity, an act of genocide. Germans were tried, and they cited the California statutes in their own defense, to no avail. They were found guilty. However, Mengele's boss Virchow escaped prosecution. Virchow reestablished his connection with California eugenicists who had gone underground and renamed their crusade Human Genetics. Typical was an exchange. July 25, 1946, when Popenoe wrote Virchow, "It was indeed a pleasure to hear from you again. I have been very anxious about my colleagues in Germany. I suppose sterilization has been discontinued in Germany?" Popenoe offered tidbits about various American eugenics luminaries, and then sent various eugenics publications. In a separate package, Popenoe sent some cocoa, coffee, and other goodies. Virchow wrote back, "Your very friendly letter of 7/25 gave me a great deal of pleasure, and you have my heartfelt thanks for it. The letter builds another bridge between your and my scientific work. I hope that this bridge will never again collapse, but rather make possible valuable mutual enrichment and stimulation." Soon Virchow again became a respected scientist in Germany and around the world. In 1949, he became a corresponding member of the newly formed American Society of Human Genetics, organized by American eugenicists and geneticists. In the fall of 1950, the University of Munster offered Virchow a position at its new Institute of Human Genetics, where he later became a dean. In the early and mid-1950s, Virchow became an honorary member of numerous prestigious societies, including the Italian Society of Genetics, the Anthropological Society of Vienna, and the Japanese Society for Human Genetics. Human genetics became an enlightened endeavor in the late 20th century. Hard-working, devoted scientists finally cracked the human code through the Human Genome Project. Now, every individual can be biologically identified and classified by trait and ancestry. Yet even now, some leading voices in the genetic world are calling for a cleansing of the unwanted among us, and even a master human species. There is understandable wariness about more ordinary forms of abuse, for example, in denying insurance or employment based on genetic tests. On October 14th, the United States' first genetic anti-discrimination legislation passed the Senate by unanimous vote. Yet because genetic research is global, no single nation's law can stop the threats. And this is just a brief history of the Rockefellers' involvement in eugenics and their overall effect on the world. Now, just imagine when I get into more detail as to how their belief in eugenics created AIDS and how they distributed this virus, this man-made virus, worldwide.